Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Dr. Ruby Gourdine, and I'm a full professor at Howard University School of Social Work, where I'm the chair of the Direct Services Sequence. I have participated in research in the areas of female violence, overrepresentation of children of color in the child welfare system, and developmental disabilities. I have been a PI or co-PI on research grants and training grants, child welfare reform, and domestic violence. I've had an extensive history in social work, having worked in protective services, adoptions, foster care, and medical social work, as well as an administrator in social work organizations. I thank you all for being here today. The webinar is a part of the Rutgers University Alumni Association's virtual event series, which offers Rutgers alumni and friends the opportunity to stay connected and hear from faculty members across the university. Today, we are honored to have with us Dr. Abigail Williams-Butler. Abigail Williams-Butler, PhD, MSW, MA, is an assistant professor of the School of Social Work at Rutgers. She received her PhD from the University of Michigan in the Joint Social Work and Developmental Psychology program. Her research interests focus on the understanding of the developmental trajectory of adolescents in the child welfare and juvenile justice systems, examining the intersectional nature of child and adolescent development within child-serving systems, the process of resilience and innovative approaches toward trauma-informed care for those in child welfare serving systems. Please note, all attendees have been placed on mute for the duration of the discussion. If you have questions, please send them to the question answer option at the bottom of your screen throughout the presentation. Following the discussion, Rutgers doctoral student Kate Gourdine will read your questions aloud to our panelists. She will get to as many questions as possible. So now it's my privilege to turn it over to Dr. Abigail Williams-Butler. Excuse me. Okay. You're on mute. You're on mute. Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Gourdine, for that wonderful introduction. I want to take a moment to thank the Rutgers Alumni Association for inviting me to present on this topic, which is near and dear to my heart. And this really gives an opportunity for us to continue a conversation that me and Dr. Gourdine and my doctoral student, Kate Gourdine, we've been discussing for the past couple of years regarding this topic. So we're really excited to be able to be here today with you all and share what we have come up with. So, all right, I think we're all together now. All right, so I just want to note that this conversation today, racialized and gender disparities within the child welfare system, it's important to note that in addition to talking about these different issues, that it's really important to understand as social workers, we prioritize systemic change and justice and social justice, but it's also important to understand how things got this way in the first place. And so this talk is going to take a historical viewpoint before digging in specifically to look at child welfare policies. And as this is an alumni audience, as opposed to a social work audience, I just want to make sure we're all on the same page in regards to what is social work. So I remember when I first, started saying, oh, I'm going to sign up for the MSW program, social work program. Everybody was, oh, that's really exciting, but what exactly is social work? So just want to have so we're on the all common page. I think most people think that, oh, well, those are the baby snatchers, right? The social workers. And though child maltreatment is kind of in that area, there are other areas of social work that we're going to talk about as well. Before digging into intersectionality, that's the framework that undergirds the talk today. Critical discourse analysis, which is the methodology that I use for the study before the historical analysis, and federal child welfare policies. So it's important to note that we will be discussing federal child welfare policies, not anything related to the states or variation in the state policies. So before jumping in, so what is social work? So social work is a practice-based profession that works with all age groups within a population. This includes adults, the aging population, couples, and of course, children and families. Social workers can work in a variety of settings from the individual to the community, even society as a whole, working toward the betterment of the human condition and well-being of all client groups. So I think it's important to note the historical origins of the social work profession in the United States, as we're going to talk about it historically throughout time. So social work began as home visiting in the late 1800s. These friendly visitors were often unpaid volunteers, which did not have formalized training. Many of the original friendly visitors were middle-class white women who were often seeking to help, aid, and support poor whites and immigrant populations, as Black families and children were excluded from these services. But I get ahead of myself. We'll discuss this a little more in more detail later. But there's been a renewed interest in light of Black Lives Matter movement and the murders of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd and so many other Black lives lost to acknowledge and address the social control aspect of the social work profession and the power differentials between for the most part, white middle-class social workers and their predominantly low-income or poverty-stricken Black and brown clientele. This is especially relevant as it relates to the child welfare system. But again, I jump ahead of myself. I want to give us some fundamentals and common language around what we will be discussing today. So taking a look at this figure here, this is the ecological systems theory. This is what I tend to call the unofficial theory of social work, though there's several theories that are very important and are used within the social work, framework. But here, as you can see at the individual level, I have child here because I'll primarily be talking about children. You have these different systems of influence around the individual. So there's the micro system, which involves the family or the school or daycare facilities that interact particularly with the child. The meso system is the interaction of these different microsystems. So how the family interacts with the school or the family interacts with the daycare facility. The exosystem is extended family and neighbors. So those that also have something to do that involve with the individual. The macro system is the attitudes and ideology of the culture that radiate and impact the individual. And then the chronosystem is the environmental changes that occur over the life course. So this is just giving a little bit overview of, so when I say social work, this is what I'm talking about, though I will be focusing primarily on the talk with child maltreatment. And so what exactly is child maltreatment? So child maltreatment is supposedly the primary reason why children and families come into contact with the child welfare system. So this occurs when a child experiences physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, or neglect. So what are these different things? So physical abuse is characterized by a physical injury that results from being kicked, beaten, shaken, thrown, stabbed, etc. Physical things that happen by a caregiver or someone older in the household toward the child. Emotional or psychological abuse damages a child's sense of self-worth. So belittling, humiliating, rejecting a child to the extent that their self-esteem and development is undermined. Sexual abuse is any sexual activity as the child cannot give consent, which includes sexual penetration, touching or petting, or voyeurism, getting sexual pleasure from watching others when they're naked or engaging in sexual activity. And of course, neglect. And it's important to note that neglect is actually the #1 reason why children and families come in contact with the child welfare system. And neglect is a failure of the parent to provide medically adequate support in the areas of health, nutrition, shelter, education, or supervision. And there are different types of neglect. So for example, physical neglect is not providing home or shelter for a child. Emotional neglect is not being there for their psychological development and positive well-being in that way. Educational neglect is when the child doesn't go to school, the child isn't getting to school. So depending on who you talk to, there are a lot of different reasons for explaining why there's contact in with the child welfare system. So child factors, parent or caregiver factors, family factors, all of these are very important. And I have areas of research devoted to each of these different areas. But today I'm going to focus primarily on the structural factors of the cause for contact with the child welfare system. And so these structural factors include poverty and unemployment, children living in dangerous communities, or the primary topic that I'm going to talk about today is racism and sexism, and what I'm referring to as structural gendered racism. And intersectionality is the framework that allows for these things to be explained.
Okay, at this point, Abigail, I know you use intersectionality and, let me get it straight, critical discourse analysis. Could you help us understand how those frameworks contributed to your research?
Yeah, so intersectionality really takes, it's a way of understanding the impact of multiple identities on the lived experiences of an individual. So in 1989, Kimberly Crenshaw formally coined the term intersectionality to describe the multiple oppressions that Black women face in society related to race and gender equally. This oppression is unique compared to Black men and white women who both have privileges related to gender and race respectively. For example, a Black woman in America does not experience gender inequality in the same way as a white woman, nor racial oppression identical to that experienced by a Black man. And intersectionality really gets at the unique oppression that Black women experience within society. Since this time, intersectionality has been expanded to a broad range of multiple oppressions across a wide range of identities. But I think it's really important for the purpose of our talk to note that we're centering the experiences of Black women and children and families within the child welfare system, particularly as it relates to race, gender, and class. So you asked about critical discourse analysis. And critical discourse analysis is what I use in this particular study that I'm going to be talking about for the duration of the talk to explain how language is used in order to move these things forward. However, I think I'd be remiss if I didn't note whose shoulders that I'm standing on today regarding this topic. So Dorothy Roberts has spoken at great length about these issues in her books, Killing the Black Body, Shattered Bonds. I recently attended a talk that she gave at the Rutgers School of Social Work discussing her upcoming book regarding the child welfare system, also known as the family surveillance system, which will examine how the child welfare system, despite its supposed purpose, the practical purpose is surveilling predominantly Black families under a system of control. So really looking forward to this new book and the issues that she's gonna get to. But the focus of the remainder of the talk, I'm going to argue that the current overrepresentation of Black children in the child welfare system is the result of racialized, gender, and class-based marginalization of poor and poverty-stricken Black mothers. The marginalization of Black mothers has by extension impacted the well-being of Black children and families in contact with the child welfare system. In this talk, I'll explore the mechanisms of how this structural gendered racism has been presented within the child welfare system. So structural gendered racism, I've said it a couple of times. So this is a concept that has been particularly relevant as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, as noted by Whitney Lasser-Pirtle and Tashil Wright in their recent publication, Structural Gendered Racism, Revealed in Pandemic Times, Intersectional Approaches to Understanding Race and Gender Health Inequities. And this was recently published in the Journal of Gender and Society. I highly suggest you take a look if you haven't seen it yet. So I'll focus particularly on the mechanisms of the value-laden language within child welfare policy, as it played a role in precipitating the overrepresentation of poor Black women and children within the child welfare systems. And these ideas can be found within one of my latest publications in the Journal of Child Welfare. And the title of that article is Intersectionality in Child Welfare Policy, Implications for Black Women, Children, and Families. This article was written in collaboration with two amazing doctoral students, Kate Gourdine, who is here with us today, as well as Alicia Mendez, and a former Rutgers student and alum right now, Brianna Stevens, who graduated from public policy, the program of public policy, and is currently working in DC. So wonderful students. Thank you all so much for your contributions. So let's see.
Okay. I know you have introduced the various policies. Before you get into analysis, you might want to cover those and look at, how those policies have affected child welfare. I know you want to do that in more detail a little bit later in your discussion, but just kind of to note those policies. I think it's very difficult for people to know specifically the names of these child welfare policies. Actually, be truthful, probably a lot of social workers might not know the names of all of those. But if you could kind of elaborate on what they are and how you might want to discuss them later as you progress in your discussion.
Yeah, definitely. So I'll be primarily examining 7 child welfare policies. And I have an infographic that I'm going to show on the next slide that details them. But before jumping into that, I want to just note that I'm using critical discourse analysis to analyze these policies. And so what is critical discourse analysis? So critical discourse analysis focuses on how inequality is expressed and reproduced through text and speech. So it critically describes, interprets, and explains the way value-based language constructs, maintains, and legitimizes social inequality. So I have some examples here. So you hear the term at risk, right? So that's a very stigmatizing and marginalizing way to discuss populations or groups. So it's much better to use less stigmatizing language, such as those who are more likely to be involved with. So being at risk for involvement with the child welfare and juvenile justice system is not ideal because it really stigmatizes that population. Whereas saying these youth are more likely to be involved with the child welfare and juvenile justice system would be a better way to say these types of things. Another example, illegal immigrant versus undocumented immigrant. Just being aware of how the power that's in language and what does it mean when someone is an illegal immigrant as opposed to an undocumented immigrant. And so, yeah, intersectionality is the discourse of focus for these child welfare policies, which I will be discussing. And intersectionality is used as a focus to understand what Ian Haney Lopez has described as dog whistle politics that uses coded racial appeals, particularly focusing on Black women, children, and families as it relates to the child welfare policies. And so these are the policies that I will be discussing in more detail today. So the Social Security Act, Titles 4 and 5, the Fleming Rule, passed in 1960, the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act of 1974, the Child Welfare Act of 1978, the Multi-Ethnic Placement Act of 1994, the Interethnic Placement Act of 1996, and the Adoption and Safe Families Act of 1997. All right, so again, just wanted to have a little bit of a historical overview to give some context to these policies before we discuss them. So Black children were systematically excluded from formal child welfare services. So it's really important to note that the child welfare system was not designed to serve Black families. It was created primarily to serve the needs of immigrants and poor and working class whites. In light of these discriminatory practices, the Black community developed formal and informal systems of care to meet the needs of children. These systems include being housed with extended family members, being cared in for orphanage and day nurseries that were Black run, or living in home for working girls. It was not until the passage of the Social Security Act that the first attempt at integrating Black children into the child welfare system was made. And so the first policy that we're going to discuss is The Social Security Act, Title IV, grants to state for aids to dependent children, and Title V, Part 3, to the Child Welfare Services Program. So Title IV provided federal assistance to families with little or no income. It was the first federal policy where poor Black children could be included to receive federal services. At the same time, Title V, Part 3 of the Child Welfare Services Program was the first federal policy regarding child welfare services in the United States. So the Social Security Act was the first policy that shifted child welfare services from the private domain to the public domain. And here you can see Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He's signing the Social Security Act with members of his cabinet. Shortly after the passing of the Social Security Act, many states established home suitability and illegitimate child clauses. These clauses lacked specific criteria and were used by states to deny or expel Black family service receipt, typically welfare claimants, as being a Black single parent was often determined to be the demonstration of immorality and an indicator of unacceptable sexual behavior. A great example of this is the Louisiana incident, where approximately 23,000 children, 28% of the state's caseload, that were overwhelmingly Black, 98%, were kicked off the rolls, the welfare rolls, because they were claimed they were illegitimate and promiscuity of the families. These policies promoted gender and racist and sexist ideals of sexuality towards primarily Black women. For example, determining it was socially unacceptable for women to have children out of wedlock. While the Aid to Dependent Children program relieves some of the responsibility for Black children from the informal and private sector, the value-laden language regarding immoral families and illegitimate child clauses really played a role here in overrepresentation. And again, I mean, just taking a look at this picture here, I just think it says so much that these were the people who signed the policy into law, right? So they're all white men and one white woman. I mean, when you think about it like that, who's in the room when these policies are being made? And then is it really a surprise or a shock when, you know, the impact or the income are detrimental for different groups of people that are not those that are in the room? Just something to keep in mind.
And you make a point that's kind of relevant for today.
Yes.
In terms of who's making decisions.
Yes, and this continues on until today, because who is in the room when these policies are being made? And then you have time 10, 15, 20 years later, oh, we can't believe there are these disparities. Oh, we can't believe all of these things, but who's there when these decisions are being made? Whose best interest are these policies really designed to serve? Something to think about.
Exactly.
So, but back to the Social Security Act. So children who were removed from the public assistant roles were later classified as neglected due to their caretakers' lack of adequate income to provide for their needs. So neglect became synonymous with poverty, particularly regarding Black women who have children. As a result, the National Association of Advancement of Colored People charged that the Title IV practices were a symptom of states' feelings towards Black families, deeming the practice of withholding welfare benefits to be racist. And so what ended up happening is that fewer resources were given to these, fewer resources led to more children being removed from their home and adoption rates soaring. And transracial adoption began to become a regular practice. And I'm really looking forward to where we're going to discuss about transracial adoptions and the clinical experiences that Dr. Gourdine has with transracial adoption as well. So the next policy here is the Fleming Rule, which was passed in 1960. And this called for states to stop denying families financial assistance. This was supposedly an attempt to administratively correct for the discriminatory practice of excluding poor families from receiving services. The Fleming Rule required states to attend to the needs of children regardless of the suitability of their home. Rather than withholding benefits, the Fleming Rule called for more case supports and supervision to overcorrect for previously being denied services. So the rule required that abuse or neglect was occurring in the home, rather than illegitimacy or promiscuity in order to receive services. And the number of neglect cases increased dramatically. This policy also moved the processing of child welfare cases to the legal system, meaning predominantly poor Black families now had to operate primarily within a white legal system without the option of opting out, which was the case previously. So no mention of race was indicated in the passing of the Fleming Rule. Only class was noted, despite the racialized implications of the rule. So consequently, the overrepresentation of Black children occurred and increased dramatically after the passing of the Fleming Rule, because again, it's now saying, oh, well, they need more services. They need more services. And so it's important to note the language here has moved from immoral or to neglectful or abusive. But again, this is the power of the language that's being noted throughout. And then the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act was passed in 1974, CAPTA. This is what most people think of as, oh, this is the beginning of the child welfare system. But as we've talked about, there were actually things happening previously before then that have influenced this. But what CAPTA did is that in order for states to qualify for federal child welfare funding, each state was required to pass a mandated reporting law for suspected and known cases of abuses and neglect. The law did not provide an operationalized definition of child abuse and neglect. Instead, CAPTA broadly defined child abuse and neglect as any physical or mental injury that was where negligent treatment or maltreatment of the child took place. This all-inclusive explanation for maltreatment was considered controversial because of its lack of clarity and overt absence surrounding income disparities. So CAPTA really introduced significant bias against poor Black families, particularly due to the broad definition of abuse and neglect. Without distinct guidance on the differences between poverty and neglect, race and class differences between what predominantly white middle-class child welfare workers considered acceptable parenting practices was compared with the predominantly poor, low-income Black families investigated by child welfare services. And as one would expect, led to an overrepresentation of Black children in the child welfare system. So for example, during the 1970s, an ideal home consisted of a two-parent family, a non-working mother, a bedroom for each child, and home ownership. So this criteria is it was nearly impossible then and nearly impossible today, I think. And so again, we can just kind of see that without a clear definition of abuse and neglect, workers reported cases of abuse and removed children based on mere intuition, fueled by cultural values related to white middle-class parenting ideals. So for example, eating too much fast food was seen as a basis for neglect, as it did not follow white middle-class parenting ideals. This disproportionately affected poor Black families and resulted in their increased representation. And so CAPTA is an example that particularly highlights the intersectional nature of class-based oppression that led to this over-involvement of Black children and families. Next is the Indian Child Welfare Act.
All right.
So though ICWA specifically targeted Native American children, there were specific provisions that were significant for all children receiving child welfare services. So it created two precedents. The first emphasized appropriate permanency option for children of color who are more likely of losing their cultural and family ties in out-of-home placements. And the second focused on permanency planning to promote exiting foster care through reunification or adoption, rather than having youth languish in foster care. So ICWA also focused on permanency. ICWA's focus on permanency. It motivated a series of congressional subcommittee hearings focused primarily on adoption as a strategy for reducing the number of youth in care without permanent placements. So one of the major implications of ICWA, or why it was passed, is a result of the increase of transracial adoptions. And here, Black children and Native American families had something in common. And there was a huge backlash in terms of the feeling to desire to whitewash Native American and Black children. And the National Association of Black Social Workers partnered with Native American tribal leaders in an outcry to end transracial adoption. And so, there was, as a result of the passing, some states made transracial adoption illegal. However, some argue that it led to foster care drift, which would result in Black children entering foster care and often staying longer. So, Dr. Gourdine, I know you have a wealth of experience in this area. So yeah, I'd like for you to kind of just share kind of your perceptions during this time around transracial adoption, Indian Child Welfare Act, MEPA. I'm going to speak about those later, but just kind of your experiences, lived experiences.
Right. Transracial adoptions, I know around African-American children occurred because there became the decreased availability of white infants. And so the next option for people who were looking to increase their family was to look transracially in terms of adoption. And so in 1972, the NABSW, which is Black Social Workers, wrote a position paper objecting to transracial adoptions and citing culture and differences of experiences and how children would be integrated into their own culture. And so as a result of that, transracial adoption stopped. However, there were advocacy groups that worked very hard, and I think that led to one of the areas you're going to talk about later is the MEPA legislation, where people argued that they were being denied an opportunity to adopt children who were waiting. Now, actually, some of the statistical data said that African Americans really adopted at higher rates than others. And there have been noted programs that were effective in moving African American children into African American homes. And I think it doesn't get enough attention that those efforts were made. And so I think now what you have with the Native Americans is the same thing. People wanted to adopt those children. The tribal leaders were opposed that. And so they lobbied to get the Indian Child Welfare Act. But it still seems to be that people are, how can I say, not really adhering to the law, because you still hear of people adopting Native Americans, and there's arguments about, if a person's living tribally or not. And so it gets complicated. And so what we do have now is the incidences of Black children being overrepresented. I think because I think some efforts have not been made, and some of the policies you're going to talk about later really kind of fit into why this has happened. The other thing that you mentioned that is very, very important to all of this is the neglect factor, because people can be placed in foster care or set up for adoption based on the fact that maybe they didn't have appropriate clothing to go to school, which is a sign of poverty and not necessarily a sign of neglect. Because if you're poor and you can't afford it, you can't do it. And so that has resulted in the overrepresentation. And one of the other things I want to mention about transracial adoption is, and I don't know if I'm jumping ahead of your talk later, is, and we can explain that later, is that as a result of the passage of MEPA and IEPA, that actually white parents were getting more preference to do the adoption than Black families. And so you had an increase of white families adopting children versus Black families who were being competitive against white families. And because white families had filed legal issues around departments that made a decision not to place with them. Many department people and social workers were kind of advised to or related to placing children with white families in order not to face legal ramifications because they might, sue for saying they were discriminated against. So that's kind of an irony of all of this in terms of how people see child placement, how people see their rights for child placement. And I think one of the things that some colleagues and I did some research on recently, not too long ago, was around the fact that the children who, a number of Black children who were coming into care were coming in as older children, which is a problem because there are a lot of issues going on by the time the child came into care. So some of this legislation was really aimed at the younger children, newborns or toddlers. And now you're talking about 12, 14-year-old kids coming into care, even for the first time. And so that has created, I would say, a number of factors in terms of who would adopt these children. Would they remain in their foster care homes if the foster parents were amenable to that or not? And so that created a different level of looking at how do we place children, because you're not talking about a cuddly infant.
Right.
Right. And you could be talking about a teenager who is in the midst of being a teenager, which is even difficult for natural families to deal with. So I think, those were, I think that's some of the issues around transracial adoption. I think it also fits into our issues with understanding how systems work and how racial issues fit into those systems.
Yes, thank you so much, and that ties in so wonderfully with MEPA, right?
Right.
Because how MEPA was created for legal protections to reduce excessive lengths of stay by children of color in care. And one of the arguments, right, is that, oh, well, you're trying to do all these same race adoptions now, as opposed to as a result of ICWA. And so what MEPA was saying is that, well, there are lots of families out here, right? And states are required to develop diligent plans for recruiting diverse adoptive and foster families and to expand the pool of eligible families. However, there was some unclear language within MEPA. And due to that unclear language, the passage of the Interethnic Placement Act occurred a couple of years later. And so what that did was repeal the unclear language of MEPA. But what the Interethnic Placement Act did is that it explicitly encouraged child workers to not discriminate against families who want to adopt children of a different race, regardless of racial readiness. And so this really just gets back to kind of some of the things you're talking about in terms of, again, power, in terms of the role that race constantly plays throughout these different types of experiences. And it's just important noting here, particularly the language of diligently recruiting more diverse families, though it was not enforced. Because again, what does diligent mean? Because we're thinking about talking about federal policies, right? So then it's left to the state to have the discretion in terms of identifying these things. And who, again, if you think back to the picture, who again is doing most of the implementation of these policies that are being passed, and who is it impacting? So this really leads us to, which as you noted, it really results in more Black children being overrepresented. So the Adoption and Safe Families Act of 1997, this is the last policy that I have. This required child safety to be the chief consideration in any decision-making situation. And so what ASFA is it mandated a permanency hearing after a child had been in care for 12 months, and for every 12 months that child is in care. So if a child has been in care for 15 of the last 22 months, states are required to file a termination of parental rights. Therefore, if parents cannot quickly resolve their problems, that led to their children into placement. Reasonable efforts to reunify the child and the parent are not required. So for those of us that are in the child welfare field, there are so many reasons that 12 months, 15 months, 22 months period, it just isn't enough time. Substance abuse, poverty, finding a job. There's so many different reasons why this just isn't enough time. However, this particular policy particularly disproportionately impacted Black children. So the termination of parental rights were sometimes prioritized even prior to a permanency plan being in place. Children who experience the termination of parental rights often desire to be reunified with their biological families or stay with their biological families. This is something that the policy did not take into account. Additionally, the time requirement made it increasingly difficult to apply the Interethnic Placement Act because diligently recruiting more diverse families takes time. So consequently, Black children that were older or had behavioral emotional disadvantages, they were more likely to languish in care as a result. It might have had, intentions. The intentions might have been good. However, the application of this had really detrimental impact, particularly on Black children and their families.
And I think your point is well taken, is that the time period was too short. If you think about changing a whole life system, and maybe if you've been on public welfare and it's discontinued, and you haven't been in the job market, you haven't maybe received enough education to get a decent job. You may have housing problems as a result of a child removal, and then getting into a new place with like poor rental history or monetary problems would be difficult. So I think it had the intentions of moving people out of care quickly, but it also had the intent, maybe the unexpected result of not unifying families that could have used help in the intervention rather than just being told that you have this 12 months, 15 months, 22 months to move. And I can imagine if anybody who's had problems and been told that you have to solve it in this time, we know people can go years without addressing their problems. And so this policy is problematic just for that reason. Yeah.
Definitely. So just to take a look back in terms of the timeline of the policies that we talked about, back to the value laden language. So in the Social Security Act, there was immorality, home suitability, and illegitimate clauses that were used to discriminate against Black families. With the Fleming Rule, abuse and neglect was required to receive services. The neglect then became the primary reason for service authorization. In regards to CAPA, abuse and neglect was introduced, but there wasn't a specific definition. And it also did not address the culturally distinct child rearing practices, which often differed between the child welfare workers and their families. In regards to ICWA, it highlighted the need for cultural congruence in placement, and some blamed it for foster care drift, so that kids of color stayed in the system longer. MEPA created legal protections to reduce excessive length, and it required the development of diligent plans for recruiting diverse adoptive families. Whereas the Interethnic Placement Act, child welfare workers were especially encouraged not to discriminate against families wanting to adopt child of a different race. And then ASFA brought in child safety as the chief consideration in placement of decision-making. But even if we just take it back, focusing particularly on ASFA again, child safety, who are you protecting them from? You're protecting them from, if neglect is the number one reason that kids are in the child welfare system, you're protecting them from the poverty of their parents? Who exactly and what exactly are we protecting? But again, the language, the value within language. And so in conclusion, so what we've discussed today is a long history of racism, sexism, and classism in the child welfare policy. And so structural gendered racism, I just think that's a really great term that was coined by recently, and it really applies to the child welfare policy, particularly at the federal level. Though this language is often intentionally race neutral on the surface, using the lens of intersectionality, examining historical, legal, and empirical social science texts shows that child welfare policy is disproportionately detrimental to Black women, children, and families. And so I just argue here that it's essential that future studies use intersectionality to understand the historical influences of the racialized, gendered, and class-based legacy of child welfare policy in the United States. And it's also essential that anti-oppressive practices are used to address these multiple different oppressions. And that's all that I have for today.
Okay, thank you. A wonderful job of explaining the child welfare system. I'm hoping people who have signed up for the sessions have been able to learn a lot about child welfare that goes beyond the child snatching scenario people have, or the limited view they have that social workers who participate in or not only in child welfare, just services to communities, have to deal with in terms of dealing with the legislation, and also recognizing the issues that real families go through, and that sometimes within the looking at the regs don't really address the issues that exist in the community. And so we have a sort of a disconnect between what people are asserting what people should do in terms of their job responsibilities to what people actually view in the communities. And so we still are, and we're at a point where I've been on a couple workshops or webinars that are addressing about disrupting the child welfare system, changing systems, being anti-racist. And so people seem to be, quote, woke about the issues that are currently existing. So I do think the conversation is different now in terms of how to address racism and child welfare. However, it's kind of interesting to know how we got to this point. And so having people talk about it and attempt to do something is a good thing. We just have to make sure it doesn't fall back into what we've done before. And, you know, that certainly is something to be concerned about. But we do have the opportunity now to advocate and restructure child welfare as we know it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, Kate, did we get any questions?
We did. We got a number of questions. So the first question that we got is, what is the impact of child welfare policies that prevent people of color from getting custody of their children, i.e. criminal background or getting custody of children, criminal background, CPS history?
Yeah. So thank you. That was a great question. And Kate, I wanted to give you a chance to introduce yourself as well. I know that you are a rising doctoral student that is closer to the end than the beginning. I didn't know if you just wanted to take a couple of moments and introduce yourself and talk about your research interests too.
Thank you so much. Yeah. Hi, everyone. I am a rising fifth year here. I'm affiliated with the Center for Child Wellbeing at the School of Social Work. My research areas of interest are related to the impact of the child welfare system on relative to identity and issues of power and voice, agency for those who are impacted by the system. My dissertation is what I'm primarily working on right now, and that explores how place intersects with social identity for those who had lived foster care experience.
Okay, interesting.
Yes.
And good.
Yeah. But yeah, so the question, yeah, that was a great question. in terms of what role does the criminal justice system play, if I can just more or less. And again, Dorothy Roberts has, you know, spoken and written extensively on this topic, particularly if you're focusing on Black women. Women are the caretakers, right, traditionally. And so if Black women are incarcerated, who's taking care of the kids, you know? So, you know, there are different compositions of family dynamics and things such as that, but that criminal justice involvement for Black men as well, not being involved or being able to play a role within the caregiving process, it has a very detrimental impact on the outcomes of these kids, on just overrepresentation, on all of these different types of topics. So again, you can see how there really is an overlap. And so that's why in my work, actually, I do child welfare, but also juvenile justice as well, because there is so much overlap. And if you take this from a developmental lens, because in addition to being a social worker, I'm also a developmental psychologist. And so if you're looking at the individual, what's happening is these individual kids are simply bouncing in and out of different systems. You know, they might start in one and move to the other, or go here or go, you know, somewhere else. But again, there's overlap. There's just constant overlap between a lot of these systems, and particularly the role that parents play in regards to their contact with these systems that decrease their ability to parent and be there. And the cycle kind of begins over again. So yeah, thank you. That was a great question.
So another question that we have speaks specifically to adoption. So this question is, how can adoption be managed better to equalize the system? What outreach programs are offered to identify and train minority adults that could adopt children?
Yeah, this, I feel like Dr. Gourdine, this is kind of your area. We've had several conversations about this. This might be a great place if you wanted to discuss a little bit more.
Okay, so this is about adoption and how we can improve it. Well, I think the presentation really addressed many of those issues, because the policies we currently have are not really totally effective. And so one of the things that we have to be is probably more culturally aware when we're making decisions about how children will be placed and what issues should go into that. One of the articles I wrote with Dr. Ladner, and we looked at transracial adoption, is that you compare, and I think this is why people say Black people don't adopt, if you compare what we call the worthiness scales, and once you talk about who's worthy, the way society is set up, it's not African-American people, it's not other people of color, it's more driven toward whites because they have maybe more money, they have maybe what people would think were the specific criteria to make a perfect home. And we know that that doesn't really exist for many people at all. Even people, you know, in everyday life, you don't have necessarily a perfect home. And so I think that more consideration to culture. And I really am going to say for Abigail doing this presentation is looking at, and I know it's a touchy subject now, is race as it's impacted society. Because one of the things I know, Rita Simon at American University wrote extensively about strong support for interracial adoption, but did not see how those kids fared at the end of that experience. And so I've met with some of those or had the opportunity to work with and deal with people who have been transracially adopted, and they had a lot of identity issues. And so while I'm not saying that children should not have a home and we should never look at people and all that, I am saying that's important for us to understand how children develop and how they feel about themselves as a result of being in a system or having, you know, been adopted. Because if you can't understand the culture and the need, because that person is going to have to go out of the home to society. They're not going to be in that particular home without interacting with other people. And so I think in terms of changing the adoption system, I think there's probably some other ways of dealing with placement issues, cultural issues, the reality of racism in society. And those are the problem with laws as they come, is you have advocates, and sometimes the advocates are the people with more power. And so people at the other levels don't get to, their points of views are not really taken in. And so I think we have to be more community-based, understand what communities want, and also educate communities about childcare. And so that children may not come into care if they knew more about how they're going to be evaluated as parents. But that's a cultural issue as well, because people do what they can with what they have. And if you have poverty, which is overwhelmingly the reason for neglect complaints, then you're going to always have a disproportionate system because you haven't fixed the issues. Now with Biden's current legislation that's paying parents now, we see people don't want that. And what he's trying to do is, they say that if his program goes through, that 50% of children who are in poverty will be left out, or will be lifted out of poverty. And so that will make a tremendous impact on probably how families fare in terms of coming into care. But we have people who are opposing that because they feel it's a giveaway, and that people should go out and work, and they shouldn't get this quote free money, which has always been a problem way people see it. And so, but hopefully it passes. And I think it's a great idea to give people a lift up in terms of their income so they can adequately take care of their families. And that's part of what Abigail talked about very eloquently this afternoon, is that you have to have systems like, how do you get rid of poverty in, quote, the richest nation in the world, right? And so I think if we address some of those, that would improve the adoption system. And you have to remember, adoption is not like it was like 40 or 50 years ago when you were getting white infants set up for adoption. We're talking about kids older and that kind of thing. So even the children available for adoption don't meet the understanding of adoption years ago.
Well, unfortunately, we've run out of time. We had a number of additional questions to get to that we were not able to, although Dr. Gourdine did cover some of the content related to poverty and how do we, help improve child welfare if poverty is a key underlying issue. I want to thank Dr. Gourdine and Dr. Williams-Butler for today, and thank you to everyone who attended.
Yeah, thank you all so much. Well, really looking forward to continuing these discussions. Feel free to reach out if you want to have more discussions, and we can continue this conversation. It's something we've been talking about for years. So looking forward to continue talking about it further. So thank you all again.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for your participation and interest.